Chapter 5: Cuttlefish and Crabs. Each morning when I awoke, the bedroom would be tiger-striped by the sun peering through the shutters. As usual, I would find that the dogs had managed to crawl onto the bed without my realizing it, and would now be occupying more than their fair share, sleeping deeply and peacefully. Ulysses would be sitting by the window, staring at the bars of golden sunlight, his eyes slit into malevolent disapproval. Outside one could hear the hoarse, jeering crow of a cockerel and the soft murmuring of the hens, a sound soothing as bubbling porridge as they fed under the orange and lemon trees, the distant clonk of goat bells, sharp chittering of sparrows in the eaves, and the sudden outburst of wheezing, imploring cries that denoted one of the parent swallows had brought a mouthful of food to their brood in the nest beneath my window. I would throw back the sheet and turf the dogs out onto the floor, where they would shake and stretch and yawn, their pink tongues curled like exotic leaves, and then I would go over to the window and throw back the shutters. Leaning out over the sill, the morning sun warm on my naked body, I would scratch thoughtfully at the little pink seals the dog's fleas had left on my skin while I got my eyes adjusted to the light. Then I would peer down over the silver olive tops to the beach and the blue sea, which lay half a mile away. It was on this beach that periodically the fishermen would pull in their nets, and when they did so, this was always a special occasion for me, since the net dragged to shore from the depths of the blue bay would contain a host of fascinating sea life, which was otherwise beyond my reach. If I saw the little fishing boats bobbing on the water, I would get dressed hurriedly, and taking my collecting gear, I would run through the olive trees down to the road and along it until I reached the beach. I knew most of the fishermen by name, but there was one who was a special friend, a tall, powerful young man with a mop of auburn hair. Inevitably, he was called Spiro, after Spiridion, so in order to distinguish him from all the other Spiros I knew, I called him Coquino, or Red. Coquino took a great delight in obtaining specimens for me, and although he was not a bit interested in the creatures himself, he got considerable pleasure from my obvious happiness. One day I went down to the beach, and the net was halfway in. The fishermen, brown as walnuts, were hauling on the dripping lines, their toes spreading wide in the sand as they pulled the massive bag of the net nearer and nearer to the shore. "Your health, Kyrie, Gerry," Coquino cried to me, waving a large freckled hand in greeting, his mop of hair glinting in the sun like a bonfire. "Today we should get some fine animals for you, for we put the net down in a new place." I squatted on the sand and waited patiently, while the fishermen, chattering and joking, hauled away steadily. Presently the top of the net was visible in the shallow waters, and as it broke surface, you could see the glitter and wink of the trapped fish inside it. Hauled out onto the sand, it seemed as though the net were alive, pulsating with the fish inside it, and there was the steady staccato purring noises of their tails, flapping futilely against each other. The baskets were fetched, and the fish were picked out of the net and cast into them. Red fish, white fish, fish with wine-coloured stripes, scorpion fish like flamboyant tapestries. Sometimes there would be an octopus or a cuttlefish leering up from inside the net with a look of alarm in its human-looking eyes. Once all the edible contents of the net had been safely stowed away in the baskets, it was my turn. In the bottom of the net would be a great heap of stones and seaweed, and it was among these that I found my trophies. Once, a round flat stone from which grew a perfect coralline tree, pure white. It looked like a young beech tree in winter, its branches bare of leaves and covered with a layer of snow. Sometimes there would be a cushion starfish, almost as thick as a sponge cake and almost as large, the edges not forming pointed arms as with normal starfish, but rounded scallops. These starfish would be of a pale fawn colour with a bright pattern of scarlet blotches. Once I got two incredible crabs, whose pincers and legs, when pulled in tight, fitted with immaculate precision the sides of their oval shells. These crabs were white, with a rusty red pattern on the back that looked not unlike an oriental face. It was hardly what I would call protective coloration, and I imagine they must have had few enemies to be able to move about the seabed wearing such conspicuous livery. On this particular morning, I was picking over a great pile of weed, and Coquino, having stowed away the last of the fish in the baskets, came over to help me. There was the usual assortment of tiny squids, the size of a matchbox, pipefish, spider crabs, and a variety of tiny fish which, in spite of their small size, had been unable to escape through the mesh of the net. Suddenly, Coquino gave a little grunt, half surprise and half amusement, and picked something out of a tangled skein of seaweed and held it out to me on the calloused palm of his hand. I could hardly believe my eyes, for it was a seahorse. Browny green, carefully jointed, looking like some weird chess man. It lay on Coquino's hand, its strange protruded mouth gasping and its tail coiling and uncoiling frantically. Hurriedly, I snatched it from him and plunged it into a jar full of seawater, uttering a mental prayer to Saint Spiridion that I was in time to save it. To my delight, it righted itself, then hung suspended in the jar, the tiny fins on each side of its horse's head fluttering themselves into a blur. Pausing only to make sure that it was all right, I scrabbled through the rest of the weed with the fervour of a gold prospector panning a riverbed where he'd found a nugget. My diligence was rewarded, for in a few minutes I had 6 seahorses of various sizes hanging suspended in the jar. Enraptured by my good luck, I bid Coquino and the other fishermen a hasty farewell and raced back to the villa. Here I unceremoniously foreclosed on 14 slow worms and usurped their aquarium to house my new catches. I knew that the oxygen in the jar in which the seahorses were imprisoned would not last for long, and if I wanted to keep them alive, I would have to move quickly. Carrying the aquarium, I raced down to the sea again, washed it out carefully, filled the bottom with sand, and dashed back to the villa with it. Then I had to run down to the sea again 3 times with buckets to fill it up with the required amount of water. By the time I poured the last bucket into it, I was so hot and sweaty, I began to wonder whether the seahorses were worth it. But as soon as I tipped them into the aquarium, I knew that they were. I'd placed a small twiggy dead olive branch in the aquarium, which I had anchored to the sand, and as the seahorses plopped out of the jar, they righted themselves, and then, like ponies freshly released in a field, they sped round and round the aquarium, their fins moving so fast that you could not see them, and each one gave the appearance of being driven by some small internal motor. Having, as it were, galloped round their new territory, they all made for the olive branch, entwined their tails around it lovingly, and stood there gravely at attention. The seahorses were an instant success. They were about the only animal that I had introduced to the villa that earned the family's unanimous approval. Even Larry used to pay furtive visits to my study in order to watch them, zooming and bobbing to and fro in their tank. They took up a considerable amount of my time, for I found that the seawater soon grew rancid, and in order to keep it clear and fresh, I had to go down to the sea with buckets 4 or 5 times a day. This was an exhausting process, but I was glad that I kept it up, for otherwise I would not have witnessed a very extraordinary sight. One of the seahorses, obviously an old specimen since he was nearly black, had a very well-developed paunch. This I merely attributed to age. Then I noticed one morning there was a line along the paunch, almost as though it had been slit with a razor blade. I was watching this and wondering whether the seahorses had been fighting, and if so, what they'd used as a weapon, for they seemed so defenseless, when to my complete and utter astonishment, the slit opened a little wider, and out swam a minute and fragile replica of the seahorse. I could hardly believe my eyes. But as soon as the first baby was clear of the pouch and hanging in the clear water, another one joined it, and then another and another, until there were 20 microscopic seahorses floating around their giant parent like a little cloud of smoke. Terrified lest the other adult seahorses eat the babies, I hurriedly set up another aquarium and placed what I fondly imagined to be the mother and her offspring in it. Keeping 2 aquariums going with fresh water was an even more Herculean task, and I began to feel a bit like a pit pony, but I was determined to continue until Thursday, when Theodore came to tea, so that I could show him my acquisitions. "Aha," he said. peering into the tanks with professional zeal. "These are really most interesting. Seahorses are, of course, according to the books, supposed to be found here, but I myself have, you know, never seen them previously." I showed Theodore the mother, with her swarm of tiny babies. "No, no," said Theodore. "That's not the mother. That's the father." At first, I thought that Theodore was pulling my leg, but he went on to explain that when the female laid the eggs and they'd been fertilized by the male, they were taken into this special brood pouch by the male, and there they matured and hatched. So what I had thought was a proud mother was in reality a proud father. Soon the strain of keeping my stable of seahorses with a supply of microscopic seafood and fresh water became too great, and so with the utmost reluctance I had to take them down to the sea and release them. It was Coquino who, as well as contributing specimens from his nets to my collection, showed me one of the most novel fishing methods I had ever come across. I met him one day down by the shore, putting a kerosene tin full of seawater into his rickety little boat. Reposing in the bottom of the tin was a large and very soulful-looking cuttlefish. Coquino had tied a string around it where the head met the great egg-shaped body. I asked him where he was going, and he said he was going to fish for cuttlefish. I was puzzled because his boat did not contain any lines or nets or even a trident. How, then, did he propose to catch cuttlefish? "With love," said Coquino mysteriously. I felt it was my duty, as a naturalist, to investigate every method of capturing animals, so I asked Coquino whether it was possible for me to accompany him in order to see this mysterious process. We rowed the boat out into the blue bay until it hung over a couple of fathoms of crystal clear water. Here Coquino took the end of the long string that was attached to the cuttlefish and tied it carefully around his big toe. Then he picked up the cuttlefish and dropped it over the side of the boat. It floated in the water for a brief moment, looking up at us with what seemed to be an incredulous expression, and then, squirting out jets of water, it shot off in a series of jerks, trailing the string behind it, and soon disappeared in the blue depths. The string trailed gradually over the side of the boat, then tautened against Coquino's toe. He lit a cigarette and rumpled his flaming hair. "Now," he said, grinning at me, "we will see what love can do." He bent to his oars and rowed the boat slowly and gently along the surface of the bay, with frequent pauses during which he stared with immense concentration at this string fastened to his toe. Suddenly, he gave a little grunt, let the oars fold to the side of the boat like the wings of a moth, and grasping the line, he started to pull it in. I leaned over the side of the boat, staring down into the clear water, my eyes straining towards the end of the taut black line. Presently, in the depths, a dim blur appeared as Coquino hauled more quickly on the line and the cuttlefish came into view. As it got closer, I saw to my astonishment it was not one cuttlefish, but two, locked together in a passionate embrace. Swiftly, Coquino hauled them alongside and with a quick flip of the line landed them in the bottom of the boat. So engrossed was the male cuttlefish with his lady love that not even the sudden transition from his watery home to the open air seemed to worry him in the slightest. He was clasping the female so tightly that it took Coquino some time to prise him loose and then drop him into the tin of seawater. The novelty of this form of fishing greatly appealed to me, although I had the sneaking feeling that perhaps it was a little unsporting. It was rather like catching dogs by walking around with a bitch in season on the end of a long leash. Within an hour, we had caught 5 male cuttlefish in a comparatively small area of the bay, and it amazed me that there should be such a dense population of them in such a small area, for they were a creature that you very rarely saw unless you went fishing at night. The female cuttlefish, throughout this time, played her part with a sort of stoical indifference, but even so I felt that she should be rewarded. So I prevailed upon Coquino to let her go, which he did, with obvious reluctance. I asked him how he knew that the female was ready to attract the males, and he shrugged. "It is the time," he said. "Could you then, at this time," I inquired, "put any female on the end of a string and obtain results?" "Yes," said Coquino, But of course, some females, like some women, are more attractive than others, and then you get better results with them. My mind boggled at the thought of having to work out the comparative merits between two female cuttlefish. I felt it was a great pity that this method could not be employed with other sea creatures. The idea, for example, of dropping a female seahorse over the side on a length of cotton and then pulling her up in a tangled entourage of passionate males was very appealing. Coquino was, as far as I knew, the only exponent of this peculiar brand of fishing, for I never saw any other fishermen employ it, and indeed the ones I mentioned it to had never even heard of it, and were inclined to treat my story with a raucous disbelief. This tattered coastline near the villa was particularly rich in sea life, and as the water was comparatively shallow, it made it easier for me to capture things. I had succeeded in inveigling Leslie into making me a boat, which greatly facilitated my investigations. This craft, almost circular, flat bottomed, and with a heavy list to starboard, had been christened the Bootle Bum Trinket, and next to my donkey was my most cherished possession. Filling the bottom with jars, tins, and nets, and making a large parcel of food to take with me, I would set sail in the Bootle Bum Trinket, accompanied by my crew of Whittle, Puke, and Roger, and occasionally Ulysses my owl, should he feel so inclined. We would spend the hot, breathless days exploring remote little bays and rocky and weed-encrusted archipelagos. We had many curious adventures on these expeditions. Once we found a whole acre of seabed covered with a great swarm of sea hares, their royal purple, egg-shaped bodies with a neat pleated frill along the edge and two strange protuberances on the head, looking, in fact, extraordinarily like the long ears of a hare. There were hundreds of them, gliding over the rocks and across the sand, all heading towards the south of the island. They did not touch each other or display any interest in each other, so I assumed it was not a mating gathering, but some form of migration. On another occasion, a group of languid, portly, and good-natured dolphins discovered us, riding at anchor in a small bay, and presumably attracted by the friendly colour scheme of orange and white in which the Bootle Bum Trinket was painted, they disported themselves around us, leaping and splashing, coming up alongside the boat with their grinning faces and breathing deep, passionate sighs at us from their blowholes. The young one, more daring than the adults, even dived under the boat, and we felt his back scrape along its flat bottom. My attention was equally divided between enjoying this delightful sight and trying to quell mutiny on the part of my crew, who had all reacted to the arrival of the dolphins in their individual ways. Whittle, never a staunch warrior, had lived up to his name copiously and crouched shivering in the bows, whining to himself. Puke had decided that the only way to save his life was to abandon ship and swim for the shore, and he had to be restrained forcibly, as did Roger, who was convinced that if he was only allowed to jump into the sea with the dolphins, he would be able to kill them all, single-handedly, in a matter of moments. It was during one of these expeditions that I came across a magnificent trophy that was, indirectly, responsible for leading Leslie into court, although I did not know it at the time. The family had all gone into town, with the exception of Leslie, who was recovering from a very severe attack of dysentery. It was his first day's convalescence, and he lay on the sofa in the drawing room as weak as a kitten, sipping iced tea and reading a large manual on ballistics. He had informed me, in no uncertain terms, that he did not want me hanging around making a nuisance of myself, and so, as I did not want to go into the town, I had taken the dogs out in Bootle Bum Trinket. As I rode along, I noticed on the smooth waters of the bay what I took to be a large patch of yellow seaweed. Seaweed was always worth investigating, as it invariably contained a host of small life and sometimes, if you were lucky, quite large creatures. So I rowed towards it. But as I got closer, I saw that it was not seaweed, but what appeared to be a yellowish-coloured rock. But what sort of rock could it be that floated in some 20 feet of water? As I looked closer, I saw, to my incredulous delight, that it was a fairly large turtle. Shipping the oars and urging the dogs to silence, I poised myself in the bows and waited, tense with excitement, as the Bootle Bum Trinket drifted closer and closer. The turtle, outspread, appeared to be floating on the surface of the sea, sound asleep. My problem was to capture him before he woke up. The nets and various other equipment I had in the boat had not been designed for the capture of a turtle measuring some 3 feet in length, so the only way I felt I could achieve success was by diving in on him, grabbing him, and somehow getting him into the boat before he woke up. In my excitement, it never occurred to me that the strength possessed by a turtle of this size was considerable, and it was unlikely he was going to give up without a struggle. When the boat was some 6 feet away, I held my breath and dived. I decided to dive under him so as to cut off his retreat, as it were, and as I plunged into the lukewarm water, I uttered a brief prayer that the splash I made would not awaken him, and that, even if it did, he would still be too dozy to execute a rapid retreat. I had dived deep, and now I turned on my back, and there, suspended above me like an enormous golden guinea, was the turtle. I shot up under him and grabbed him firmly by his front flippers, which curved like horny sickles from out of his shell. To my surprise, even this action did not wake him, and when I rose gasping to the surface, still retaining my grasp on his flippers, and shook the water from my eyes, I discovered the reason. The turtle had been dead for a fair length of time, as my nose and the host of tiny fish nibbling at his scaly limbs told me. Disappointing though this was, a dead turtle was better than no turtle at all, and so I laboriously towed his body alongside the brutal bum trinket and made it fast by one flipper to the side of the boat. The dogs were greatly intrigued, under the impression that this was some exotic and edible delicacy I'd procured for their special benefit. The brutal bum trinket, owing to her shape, had never been the easiest of craft to steer, and now, with the dead weight of the turtle lashed to one side of her, she showed a tendency to revolve in circles. However, after an hour's strenuous rowing, we arrived safely at the jetty, and having tied up the boat, I then hauled the turtle's carcass onto the shore where I could examine it. It was a hawksbill turtle, the kind whose shell is used for the manufacture of spectacle frames and whose stuffed carcass you occasionally see in opticians' windows. His head was massive, with a great wrinkled jowl of yellow skin and a swooping beak of a nose that did give him an extraordinarily hawk-like look. The shell was battered in places, presumably by ocean storms or by the snap of a passing shark, and here and there it was decorated with little snow-white clusters of baby barnacles. His underside, of pale daffodil yellow, was soft and pliable, like thick, damp cardboard. I had recently conducted a long and fascinating dissection of a dead terrapin that I'd found, and I felt that this would be an ideal opportunity to compare the turtle's internal anatomy with that of his freshwater brother. So I went up the hill, borrowed the gardener's wheelbarrow, and in it transported my prize up to the house and laid him out in state on the front veranda. I knew that there would be repercussions if I endeavoured to perform my dissection of the turtle inside the house, but I felt that nobody in his right mind would object to the dissection of the turtle on the front veranda. With my notebook at the ready, and my row of saws, scalpels, and razor blades neatly laid out as though in an operating theatre, I set to work. I found that the soft yellow plastron came away quite easily compared with the underside of the terrapin, which had taken me 3/4 of an hour to saw through. When the plastron was free, I lifted it off like the cover of a dish, and there, underneath, were all the delicious mysteries of the turtle's internal organs displayed, multicoloured and odoriferous to a degree. So consumed with curiosity was I, that I did not even notice the smell. The dogs, however, who normally considered fresh cow dung to be the ideal scent to add piquancy to their love life, disappeared in a disapproving body, sneezing violently. I discovered to my delight that the turtle was a female and had a large quantity of half-formed eggs in her. They were about the size of ping-pong balls, soft, round, and as orange as a nasturtium. There were 14 of them, and I removed them carefully and laid them in a gleaming glutinous row on the flagstones. The turtle appeared to have a prodigious quantity of gut, and I decided that I should enter the exact length of this astonishing apparatus in my already blood-stained notebook. With the aid of a scalpel, I detached the gut from the rear exit of the turtle and then proceeded to pull it out. It seemed never ending, but before long I had laid it out carefully across the veranda in a series of loops and twists, like a rather drunken railway line. One section of it was composed of the stomach, a rather hideous greyish bag like a water-filled balloon. This obviously was full of the turtle's last meal, and I felt, in the interests of science, that I ought to check on what it had been eating just prior to its demise. I stuck a scalpel in the great wobbling mound and slashed experimentally. Immediately, the whole stomach bag deflated with a ghastly sighing noise, and a stench arose from its interior which made all the other smells pale into insignificance. Even I, fascinated as I was by my investigations, reeled back and had to retreat coughing to wait for the smell to subside. I knew I could get the veranda cleaned up before the family got back from town, but in my excitement with my new acquisition, I'd completely overlooked the fact that Leslie was convalescing in the drawing room. The scent of the turtle's interior, so pungent that it seemed almost solid, floated in through the French windows and enveloped the couch on which he lay. My first intimation of this catastrophe was a blood-curdling roar from inside the drawing room. Before I could do anything sensible, Leslie, swathed in blankets, appeared in the French windows. "What's that bloody awful stink?" he inquired throatily. Then, as his glance fell upon the dismembered turtle and its prettily arranged internal organs spread across the flagstones, his eyes bulged and his face took on a heliotrope tinge. "What the hell's that?" I explained, somewhat diffidently, that it was a turtle that I was dissecting. It was a female, I went on hurriedly, hoping to distract Leslie by detail. Here he could see the fascinating eggs that I'd extracted from her interior. "Damn her eggs!" shouted Leslie, making it sound like some strange medieval oath. "Get the bloody thing away from me! It's stinking the place out!" I said that I'd almost reached the end of my dissection and that I'd then planned to bury all the soft parts and merely keep the skeleton and shell to add to my collection. "You're doing nothing of the sort!" shouted Leslie. "You're going to take the whole bloody thing and bury it. Then you can come back and scrub the veranda." Lugaretzia, our cook, attracted by the uproar, appeared in the French windows next to Leslie. She opened her mouth to inquire into the nature of this family quarrel, when she was struck amidships by the smell of the turtle. Lugaretzia always had 15 or 16 ailments worrying her at any given moment, which she cherished with the same loving care that other people devote to window boxes or Pekingese. At this particular time, it was her stomach that was causing her the most trouble. In consequence, she gasped 2 or 3 times, feebly, like a fish, uttered a strangled "Saint Spiridion," and fell into Leslie's arms in a well-simulated faint. Just at that moment, to my horror, the car containing the rest of the family swept up the drive and came to a halt below the veranda. "Hello, dear," said Mother, getting out of the car and coming up the steps. "Did you have a nice morning?" Before I could say anything, the turtle, as it were, got in before me. Mother uttered a couple of strange hiccuping cries, pulled out her handkerchief and clapped it to her nose. "What," she demanded indistinctly, "is that terrible smell?" "It's that bloody boy!" roared Leslie from the French windows, making ineffectual attempts to prop the moaning Lugaretzia against the door jamb. Larry and Margot had now followed Mother up the steps and caught sight of the butchered turtle. "What?" began Larry, and then he too was seized with a convulsive fit of coughing. "It's that damn boy," he said, gasping. "Yes, dear," said Mother through her handkerchief. "Leslie's just told me." "It's disgusting," wailed Margot, fanning herself with her handkerchief. "It looks like a railway accident." "What is it, dear?" Mother asked me. I explained that it was an exceedingly interesting hawksbill turtle, female, containing eggs. "Oh, surely you don't have to chop it up on the veranda," said Mother. "The boy's mad," said Larry with conviction. "The whole place smells like a bloody whaling ship." "I really think you'll have to take it somewhere else, dear," said Mother. "We can't have this smell on the front veranda." "Tell him to bury the damn thing," said Leslie, clasping his blankets more firmly about him. Why don't you get him adopted by a family of Eskimos? Inquired Larry. They like eating blubber and maggots and things. Larry, don't be disgusting, said Margot. They can't eat anything like this. The very thought of it makes me feel sick. I think we ought to go inside, said Mother faintly. Perhaps it won't smell as much in there. If anything, it smells worse in here, shouted Leslie from the French windows. Gerry, dear, you must clean this up, said Mother, as she picked her way delicately over the turtle's entrails, and disinfect the flagstones. The family went inside, and I set about the task of clearing up the turtle from the front veranda. Their voices arguing ferociously drifted out to me. Bloody menace, said Leslie, lying here peacefully reading, and I was suddenly seized by the throat. Disgusting, said Margot. I don't wonder Lugorezia fainted. High time he had another tutor, said Larry. You leave the house for 5 minutes and come back and find him disemboweling Moby Dick on the front porch. I'm sure he didn't mean any harm, said Mother, but it was rather silly of him to do it on the veranda. Silly, said Larry caustically. We'll be blundering around the house with gas masks for the next 6 months. I piled the remains of the turtle into the wheelbarrow and took it up to the top of the hill behind the villa. Here I dug a hole and buried all the soft parts, and then placed the shell and the bone structure near a nest of friendly ants who had, on previous occasions, helped me considerably by picking skeletons clean. But the most they'd ever tackled had been a very large lizard, so I was interested to see whether they would tackle the turtle. They ran towards it, their antennae waving eagerly, and then stopped, thought about it for a bit, held a little consultation, and then retreated in a body. Apparently, even the ants were against me, so I returned dispiritedly to the villa. Here I found that a thin, whining little man, obviously made belligerent by wine, was arguing with Lugorezia on the still odoriferous veranda. I inquired what the man wanted. He says, said Lugorezia with fine scorn, that Roger has been killing his chickens. Turkeys, corrected the man. Turkeys. Well, turkeys then, said Lugorezia, conceding the point. My heart sank. One calamity was being succeeded by another. Roger, we knew, had the most reprehensible habit of killing chickens. He derived a lot of innocent amusement in the spring and summer by chasing swallows. They would drive him into an apoplectic fury by zooming past his nose and then flying along the ground just ahead of him whilst he chased them, bristling with rage, uttering roars of fury. The peasants' chickens used to hide in the myrtle bushes, and then, just as Roger was passing, they would leap out with a great flutter of wings and insane hysterical cackling right into his path. Roger, I was sure, was convinced that these chickens were sort of an ungainly swallow that he could get to grips with, and so, in spite of yells of protest on our part, he would leap on them and kill them with one swift bite, all his hatred of the teasing summer swallows showing in his action. No punishment had any effect on him. He was normally an extremely obedient dog, except about this one thing, and so, in desperation, all we could do was to recompense the owners, but only on condition that the corpse of the chicken was produced as evidence. Reluctantly, I went in to tell the family that Roger had been at it again. Christ, said Leslie, getting laboriously to his feet. You and your sodding animals. Now, dear, said Mother placatingly. Gerry can't help it if Roger kills chickens. Turkeys, said Leslie. I bet he'll want a hell of a lot for those. Have you cleaned up the veranda, dear? Inquired Mother. Larry removed a large handkerchief, drenched in eau de cologne, which he had spread over his face. Does it smell as though he's cleaned up the veranda? He inquired. I said hastily that I was just about to do it, and followed Leslie to see the outcome of his conversation with the turkey owner. Well, said Leslie belligerently, striding out onto the veranda, what do you want? The man cringed, humble, servile, and altogether repulsive. Be happy, Kyrie, be happy, he said, greeting Leslie. Be happy, Leslie replied, in a gruff tone of voice that implied he hoped the man would be anything but. What do you wish to see me about? My turkeys, Kyrie, explained the man. "I apologize for troubling you, but your dog, you see, he's been killing my turkeys." "Well," said Leslie, "how many has he killed?" "5, Kyrie," said the man, shaking his head sorrowfully. "5 of my best turkeys. I'm a poor man, Kyrie. Otherwise, I wouldn't have dreamed." "5?" said Leslie, startled, and turned an inquiring eye on me. I said I thought it was quite possible. If 5 hysterical turkeys had leapt out of a myrtle bush, I could well believe that Roger would kill them all. For such a benign and friendly dog, he was a very ruthless killer when he got started. "Roger is a good dog," said Lugarezia belligerently. She had joined us on the veranda, and she obviously viewed the turkey owner with the same dislike as I did. Apart from this, in her eyes, Roger could do no wrong. "Well," said Leslie, making the best of a bad job, "if he's killed 5 turkeys, he's killed 5 turkeys. Such is life. Where are the bodies?" There was a moment of silence. "The bodies, Kyrie?" queried the turkey owner tentatively. The bodies," said Leslie impatiently. "You know, the bodies of the turkeys. You know we can't pay you until you produce the bodies." "But that's not possible," said the turkey owner nervously. "What do you mean, not possible?" inquired Leslie. "Well, it's not possible to bring the bodies, Kyrie," said the turkey owner with a flash of inspiration, "because your dog has eaten them." The explosion that this statement provoked was considerable. We all knew that Roger was, if anything, slightly overfed, and that he was of a most fastidious nature. Though he would kill a chicken, nothing would induce him to feed upon the carcass. "Lies, lies!" shrilled Lugarezia, her eyes swimming with tears of emotion. "He's a good dog." "He's never eaten anything in his life that he's killed," shouted Leslie. "Never." "But 5 of my turkeys," said the little man. "5 of them he's eaten." "When did he kill them?" roared Leslie. "This morning, Kyrie, this morning," said the man, crossing himself. "I saw it myself, and he ate them all." I interrupted to say that Roger had been out that morning in the Bootle Bunchen kit with me, and intelligent dog though he was, I did not see how he could be consuming the prodigious quantity of 5 turkeys on this man's farm and be out in the boat with me at the same time. Leslie had had a trying morning. All he had wanted to do was lie peacefully on the sofa with his manual of ballistics. But first he'd been almost asphyxiated by my investigations into the internal anatomy of the turtle, and now he was being faced by a drunken little man trying to swindle us for the price of 5 turkeys. His temper, never under the best of control, bubbled over. "You're a two-faced liar and a cheat," he snarled. The little man backed away and his face went white. "You are the liar and the cheat," he said with drunken belligerence. "You are the liar and the cheat. You let your dog kill everybody's chickens and turkeys, and then when they come to you for payment, you refuse. You are the liar and the cheat." Even at that stage, I think that sanity could have prevailed, but the little man made a fatal mistake. He spat copiously and wetly at Leslie's feet. Lugarezia uttered a shrill wail of horror and grabbed hold of Leslie's arm. Knowing his temper, I grabbed hold of the other one too. The little man, appalled into a moment of sobriety, backed away. Leslie quivered like a volcano, and Lugarezia and I hung on like grim death. "Excreta of a pig!" roared Leslie. "Illegitimate son of a diseased whore!" The fine Greek oaths rolled out, rich, vulgar, and biological, and the little man turned from white to pink and from pink to red. He had obviously been unaware of the fact that Leslie had such a command over the fruitier of the Greek insults. "You'll be sorry," he quavered. "You'll be sorry." He spat once more with a pathetic sort of defiance, and then turned and scuttled down the drive. It took the combined efforts of the family and Lugarezia 3/4 of an hour to calm Leslie down, with the aid of several large brandies. "Don't you worry about him, Kyrie Leslie," was Lugarezia's final summing up. "He's well known in the village as a bad character. Don't you worry about him." But we were forced to worry about him, for the next thing we knew, he had sued Leslie for not paying his debts and for defamation of character. Spiro, when told the news, was furious. "Gollies, Mrs. Darlis," he said, his face red with wrath. "Why don't you let Masters Leslie's shoot the son of a bitch?" "I don't think that would really solve anything, Spiro," said Mother. "What we want to know is whether this man has any chance of winning his case." "Winnings," said Spiro with fine scorn. "That bastard won't wins anythings. You just leaves it to me. I'll fixes it."
"And now don't go and do anything rash, Spiro," said Mother. "It'll only make matters worse."
"I won't do anything rash, Mrs. Durrell, but I'll fixes that bastard." For several days he went about with an air of conspiratorial gloom, his bushy eyebrows tangled in a frown of immense concentration, only answering our questions monosyllabically. Then, one day, a fortnight or so before the case was due to be heard, we were all in town on a shopping spree. Eventually, weighed down by our purchases, we made our way to the broad, tree-lined esplanade and sat there having a drink and exchanging greetings with our numerous acquaintances who passed. Presently Spiro, who had been glaring furtively about him with the air of a man who has many enemies, suddenly stiffened. He hitched his great belly up and leaned across the table. "Master Leslie's, you see that man's over there, the one with the white hair." He pointed a sausage-like finger at a small, neat little man who was placidly sipping a cup of coffee about under the trees. "Well, what about him?" inquired Leslie. "He's the judge's," said Spiro. "What judge?" said Leslie, bewildered. "The judge's who's going to try your case," said Spiro. "I want you to go over there and talks to him." "Do you think that's wise?" said Leslie. "He might think I'm trying to muck about with the course of justice and give me 10 years in prison or something." "Goodness knows," said Spiro, aghast at such a thought. "He wouldn't put Masters Leslie's in prison. He knows better than to do that whilst I am's here."
"But even so, Spiro, don't you think he'll think it a little funny if Leslie starts talking to him?" asked Mother.
"Goodness knows," said Spiro.
He glanced about him to make sure that we weren't overheard, leaned forward and whispered,
"He collects stamps."
The family looked bewildered. "You mean he's a philatelist?" said Larry at length.
"No, no, Master Larry's," said Spiro. "He's not one of them. He's a married man, and he's got 2 children."
The whole conversation seemed to be getting even more involved than the normal ones we had with Spiro. "What," said Leslie patiently, "has his collecting stamps got to do with it?"
"I will takes you over there," said Spiro,
laying bare for the first time the Machiavellian intricacies of his plot.
"and yous tells him that you will get him some stamps from England."
"But that's bribery," said Margot, shocked.
"It isn't bribery, Mrs. Margot," said Spiro. "He collects stamps. He wants stamps."
"I should think if you tried to bribe him with stamps, he'd give you about 500 years penal servitude," said Larry to Leslie judiciously. I asked eagerly whether, if Leslie was condemned, he would be sent to Vido, the convict settlement on a small island that lay in the sparkling sea half a mile or so from the town. "No, no, dear," said Mother, getting increasingly flustered. "Leslie won't be sent to Vido." I felt this was rather a pity. I already had one convict friend, serving a sentence for the murder of his wife, who lived on Vido. He was a trustee, and so had been allowed to build his own boat and row home for the weekends. He had given me a monstrous black-backed gull, which tyrannized all my pets and the family. I felt that, exciting though it was to have a real murderer as a friend, it would have been better to have Leslie incarcerated on Vido, so that he too could come home for the weekends. To have a convict brother would, I felt, be rather exotic. "I don't see that if I just go and talk to him it can do any harm," said Leslie. "I wouldn't," said Margot. "Remember, there's many a slip without a stitch." "I do think you ought to be careful, dear," said Mother. "I can see it all," said Larry with relish. "Leslie with a ball and chain. Spiro, too, probably, as an accessory. Margot knitting them warm socks for the winter. Mother sending them food parcels and anti-lice ointment." "Oh, do stop it, Larry," said Mother crossly. "This is no laughing matter."
"All you got to do is talks to him, Master Leslie," said Spiro earnestly. "Honest to God, you got to, otherwise I can't fixes it."
Spiro had, prior to this, never let us down. His advice had always been sound, and even if it hadn't been legal, we'd never so far come to grief. "All right," said Leslie. "Let's give it a bash." "Do be careful, dear," said Mother, as Leslie and Spiro rose and walked over to where the judge was sitting. The judge greeted them charmingly, and for half an hour Leslie and Spiro sat at his table sipping coffee, while Leslie talked to him in voluble but inaccurate Greek. Presently the judge rose and left them with much handshaking and bowing. They returned to our table, where we waited agog for the news. "Charming old boy," said Leslie. "Couldn't have been nicer. I promised to get him some stamps. Who do we know in England who collects them?" "Well, your father used to," said Mother. "He was a very keen philatelist when he was alive."
"Gollies, don't say that, Mrs. Durrells,"
said Spiro, in genuine anguish. A short pause ensued while the family explained to him the meaning of the word philatelist. "I still don't see how this is going to help the case," said Larry, "even if you inundate him with penny blacks."
"Never use minds, Master Larry's," said Spiro darkly. "I said I'd fixes it, and I will. You just leaves it to me."
For the next few days, Leslie, convinced that Spiro could obstruct the course of justice, wrote to everybody he could think of in England and demanded stamps. The result was that our mail increased threefold, and that practically every free space in the villa was taken up by piles of stamps, which, whenever a wind blew, would drift like autumn leaves across the room, to the vociferous snarling delight of the dogs. As a result of this, many of the stamps began to look slightly the worse for wear. "You're not going to give him those, are you?" said Larry, disdainfully surveying a pile of mangled, semi-masticated stamps that Leslie had rescued from the jaws of Roger half an hour previously. "Well, stamps are supposed to be old, aren't they?" said Leslie belligerently. "Old, perhaps," said Larry, "but surely not covered with enough spittle to give him hydrophobia."
"Well, if you can think of a better bloody plan, why don't you suggest it?" inquired Leslie.
"My dear fellow, I don't mind," said Larry. "When the judge is running around biting all his colleagues, and you are languishing in a Greek prison, don't blame me."
"All I ask is you mind your own bloody business," cried Leslie.
Now, dear, Larry's only trying to be helpful," said Mother.
"Helpful?"
snarled Leslie, making a grab at a group of stamps that were being blown off the table.
"He's just interfering as usual."
"Well, dear," said Mother, adjusting her spectacles, "I do think he may be right, you know. After all, some of those stamps do look a little, well, you know, second-hand."
"He wants stamps. He's bloody well going to get stamps," said Leslie.
And stamps the poor judge got, in a bewildering variety of sizes, shapes, colours, and stages of disintegration. Then another thing happened that increased Leslie's confidence in winning the case 100-fold. We discovered that the Turkey man, whom Larry constantly referred to as Kripanopoulos, had been unwise enough to subpoena Lugaretzia as a witness for the prosecution. Lugaretzia, furious, wanted to refuse, until it was explained to her that she could not.
"Imagine that man calling me as a witness to help him," she said. "Well, don't you worry, Kyrie, Leslie. I'll tell the court how he forced you to swear at him and call him."
The family rose in a body, and vociferously informed Lugaretzia that she was not to do anything of the sort. It took us half an hour to impress upon her what she should and should not say. At the end of it, since Lugaretzia, like most Corfiots, was not very strong on logic, we felt somewhat jaded. "Well, with her as a witness for the prosecution," said Larry, "I shall think you'll probably get the death sentence."
"Larry, dear, don't say things like that," said Mother. "It's not funny, even in a joke."
"I'm not joking," said Larry.
"Rubbish,"
said Leslie uneasily.
"I'm sure she'll be all right."
"I think it would be much safer to disguise Margot as Lugaretzia," said Larry judicially. "With her sweeping command over the Greek language, she would probably do you considerably less harm." "Yes," said Margot excitedly, struck for the first time by Larry's perspicacity.
"Why can't I be a witness?"
"Don't be damn silly," said Leslie. "You weren't there. How can you be a witness?"
"I was almost there," said Margot. "I was in the kitchen."
"That's all you need," said Larry to Leslie. "Margot and Lugaretzia in the witness box. You won't even need a judge. You'll probably be lynched by the mob." When the day of the case dawned, Mother rallied the family. "It's ridiculous for us all to go," said Larry. "If Leslie wants to get himself into prison, that's his affair. I don't see why we should be dragged into it. Besides, I wanted to do some writing this morning." "It is our duty to go," said Mother firmly. "We must put on a bold front. After all, I don't want people to think I'm rearing a family of jailbirds." So we all put on our best clothes and sat waiting patiently until Spiro came to collect us.
Now don't you worry, Master Leslie's.
He scowled, with the air of a warder in the condemned cell.
Everything's going to be okays.
But in spite of this prophecy, Larry insisted on reciting the Ballad of Reading Gaol as we drove into town, much to Leslie's annoyance. The courtroom was a bustle of uncoordinated activity. People sipped little cups of coffee while other people shuffled through piles of papers in an aimless but dedicated way, and there was lots of chatter and laughter. Kriponopoulos was there in his best suit, but avoided our eye. Lugaretzia, for some reason best known to herself, was clad entirely in black. It was, as Larry pointed out, a premature move. Surely she should have reserved her mourning for after the trial.
Now, Master Leslie's, said Spiro, you stands there, and I stands there, and translates for you.
What for? Inquired Leslie, bewildered.
Because you don't speak Greeks, said Spiro.
Really, Spiro, protested Larry. I admit his Greek is not Homeric, but it's surely perfectly adequate.
Master Larry's, said Spiro, scowling earnestly. Master Leslie's mustn't speak Greeks.
Before we could inquire more deeply into this, there was a general scuffling and the judge came in. He took his seat and his eyes roved around the court, and then catching sight of Leslie, he beamed and bowed. Hanging judges always smile like that, said Larry. Larry, dear, do stop it, said Mother. You're making me nervous. There was a long pause while what was presumably the clerk of the court read out the indictment. Then Kriponopoulos was called to give his evidence. He put on a lovely performance, at once servile and indignant, placating but belligerent. The judge was obviously impressed, and I began to get quite excited. Perhaps I would have a convict for a brother after all. Then it was Leslie's turn.
You are accused, said the judge, of having used defamatory and insulting language to this man, and endeavouring to deprive him of rightful payment for the loss of 5 turkeys killed by your dog.
Leslie stared blank-faced at the judge. What's he say? He inquired of Spiro. Spiro hitched his stomach up.
He says, Master Leslie's,
and his voice was so pitched that it rumbled through the courtroom like thunder.
He says that you insults this man's, and that you tries to swindle him out of monies for his turkeys.
That's ridiculous, said Leslie firmly. He was about to go on when Spiro held up a hand like a ham and stopped him. He turned to the judge.
The curious denies the charge, he said. It would be impossible for him to be guilty anyway, because he doesn't speak Greek.
Christ, groaned Larry sepulchrally. I hope Spiro knows what he's doing. What's he saying? What's he doing? Said Mother nervously. As far as I can see, putting a noose around Leslie's neck, said Larry. The judge, who had had so many coffees with Leslie, and who had received so many stamps from him, and who had had so many conversations in Greek with him, stared at Leslie impassively. Even if the judge had not known Leslie personally, it would have been impossible for him not to know that Leslie had some command over the Greek language. Nothing anyone did in Corfu was sacrosanct, and if you were a foreigner, of course, the interest in and the knowledge of your private affairs was that much greater. We waited with bated breath for the judge's reactions. Spiro had his massive head slightly lowered, like a bull about to charge. I see, said the judge dryly. He shuffled some papers aimlessly for a moment, and then glanced up. I understand, he said, that the prosecution has a witness. I suppose we had better hear her. It was Lugaretzia's big moment. She rose to her feet, folded her arms, and stared majestically at the judge, her normally pale face pink with excitement, her soulful eyes glowing. You are Lugaretzia Kondos, and you are employed by these people as a cook? Inquired the judge. Yes, said Lugaretzia,
and a kinder, more generous family you could not wish to meet. Why, only the other day they gave me a frock for myself and for my daughter, and it was only a month or two that I asked the Kyrios. Yes, interrupted the judge, I see. Well, this has not got much relevance to the case. I understand you were there when this man called to see about his turkeys. Now tell me in your own words what happened.
Larry groaned. If she tells him in her own words, they'll get Leslie for sure, he said. Well, said Lugaretzia, glancing around the court to make sure she had everybody's attention,
the Kyrios had been very ill indeed. At times we despaired for his life. I kept suggesting cupping to his mother, but she wouldn't hear of it.
Would you mind getting to the point? Said the judge.
Well,
said Lugaretzia, reluctantly abandoning the subject of illness, which was always a favourite topic with her.
It was the Kyrios' first day up, and he was very weak. Then this man, she said, pointing a scornful finger at Kriponopoulos, arrived dead drunk, and said that their dog had killed 5 of his turkeys. Now the dog wouldn't do that, Kyria Judge. A sweeter, kinder, nobler dog was never seen in Corfu.
The dog is not on trial, said the judge.
Well, said Lugaretzia, when the Kyrios said, quite rightly, that he would have to see the corpses before he paid the man said he couldn't show them because the dog had eaten them. This is ridiculous, as you can well imagine, Kyria Judge, as no dog could eat 5 turkeys.
You are supposed to be a witness for the prosecution, aren't you? Said the judge. I ask you only because your story doesn't tally with the complainant's.
Him, said Lucretia. You don't want to trust him. He's a drunkard and a liar, and it's well known in the village that he has 2 wives.
So you are telling me, said the judge, endeavouring to sort out this confusion, that the Kyrios didn't swear at him in Greek and refuse payment for the turkeys?
Of course he didn't, said Lucretia. A kinder, finer, more upstanding Kyrios.
Yes, all right, said the judge. He sat pondering for some time while we all waited in suspense. Then he glanced up and looked at Kriponopoulos. I can see no evidence, he said, that the Englishman behaved in the way you have suggested. Firstly, he does not speak Greek.
He does speak Greek, shouted Kriponopoulos wrathfully. He called me a...
Will you be quiet? Said the judge coldly. Firstly, as I was saying, he does not speak Greek. Secondly, your own witness denies all knowledge of the incident. It seems to me clear, however, that you have endeavoured to extract payment for turkeys which had not, in fact, been killed and eaten by the defendant's dog. However, you are not on trial here for that, so I will merely find the defendant not guilty, and you will have to pay the costs. Immediately, pandemonium reigned. Kriponopoulos was on his feet, purple with rage, shouting at the top of his voice and calling on Saint Spiridion's aid. Spiro, bellowing like a bull, embraced Leslie, kissed him on both cheeks, and was followed by the weeping Lugaretzia, who did likewise. It was some time before we managed to extricate ourselves from the court, and jubilantly we went down to the esplanade and sat at a table under the trees to celebrate. Presently, the judge came past, and we rose in a body to thank him and invite him to sit and have a drink with us. He refused the drink shyly, and then fixed Leslie with a penetrating eye. I wouldn't like you to think, he said, that justice in Corfu is always dispensed like that, but I had a long conversation with Spiro about the case, and after some deliberation I decided that your crime was not as bad as the man's. I hoped it might teach him not to swindle foreigners in future. Well, I really am most grateful to you, said Leslie. The judge gave a little bow. He glanced at his watch. Well, I must be going, he said. By the way, thank you so much for those stamps that you sent me yesterday. Among them were 2 quite rare ones, which were new to my collection. Raising his hat, he trotted off across the esplanade.